Welcome this morning. My name is Dan Kass. I've been in the global citrus industry for over 30 years, and the topic today is an overview of the global citrus trade and changing dynamics in that trade. I'd like to introduce my guest panel here this morning, Robert Mulder, one of the family owners of Cool Control, a service provider to the global fruit and trade industry, specifically for growers around the world coming into the European market. And to his left is Marcel van der Wel, one of the owners of Ooijen Citrus, a citrus trader based here in Holland, over 40 years of history in the citrus trade, import, export into and out of the European market. Here's just an overview of my presentation today. We'll be talking about where citrus grows in the world. We'll compare what we grew versus what we grow, 1970 versus today, 2015. Drill into a little more detail, specifically on the explosion in the easy peel citrus, the Mandarin category. Again, comparing 1970 versus 2015, roughly today. We'll speak a little bit about shifting global trade patterns and emphasis on mandarins, but in general also it applies to the overall citrus category, and as time allows, we'll briefly discuss some of the market access drivers to the trade today and in the future. Again, specific emphasis on global citrus. Here we have a map of the world, and so to begin with, where does citrus grow? There are 195 countries in the world, and 140 countries grow citrus to some capacity. It may not be on a necessarily a commercial basis, but on a local basis. And then, of course, countries that also are big global players. In terms of citrus, it can grow as far as 40 degrees northern latitude. Above that, it gets too cold. Or to 40 degrees southern latitude. Again, it gets too cold above or below those latitudes. The orange areas on this map highlight the major growing regions throughout the world. And so Marcel, maybe I'd start to ask a question to you on, you look at this citrus belt, and in your time in the industry, are there any, I'll say, new countries, or what has changed in your time from sources coming into the European market from when you began, and what sources come into the EU today? What changes have you seen?
Well, my name is Marcel van der Welle. I'm from Ooijen Citrus, and I started with the company in 2001, so I can't really refer back to the 70s from when your presentation started. If we see traditionally in Europe, Spain, Italy, Greece and Morocco have been the biggest suppliers in the European season. Biggest introduction actually came from Egypt. They have more or less taken over in the months from January till like June the juicing oranges industry. Another country that came to our market was and is still Turkey. They have they're growing a huge volume of citrus, but still it's more or less regarded as a substitute for in case there is production failures or harvest failures from European countries. But they do have, of course, the access to Russia, where they supply a lot. If Erdogan and Putin work together, but currently they have a good relationship again with a lot of export products from Turkey. We've also seen countries more or less pulling out from our markets. We've had experiences with citrus from Australia. It has its ups and downs, but more or less you don't see that anymore in our market. The US came back a couple of years ago with Miniolas. We're doing quite a big programs there. Yeah, then more or less from the southern hemisphere, the traditional countries like South Africa, Peru, Argentina, Uruguay, they keep supplying as always, but it may be less in total, but still they are in the market.
All right, thanks. So Robert, just kind of taking on from what Marcel said there, from the 1980s when your father founded the company to today, what changes have happened in terms of not just citrus, but to the fruit trade and that come through your operation in Maasdijk? Was it just Mediterranean suppliers at the beginning, now it's Southern Hemisphere? Comment.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Dan. I'm Robert Mulder of Cool Control, a logistic provider specialized in storage and distribution. We have a location in Maasdijk, as Dan told. And we do a lot of import on exotics, but also on citrus. What we have seen since 20 years ago when the company been established, in fact on what Marcel told, of course, there's a lot of fruit still coming on from the Mediterranean Sea, like Turkey, Israel, traditional, Egypt and Morocco. Especially Egypt, Morocco are the ones that specialized much more the last couple of years. And they use Rotterdam much more as a strategic point to trade also to more countries like on the Eastern Europe. If we see what will be less than compared to 20 years, my point of view, and maybe Marcel has another idea about it, we see less and less fruits coming in from South Africa, citrus, due to the fact that there's a lot of black spot could be found, so growers are quite afraid to send those fruits over. And they have other options as well. Europe is not the first market anymore. You can see the Far East, Middle East give a lot of competition to Europe on that fact. On the other side, if I may talk about exotic part, we're speaking about limes, Brazil, Mexico, which still growing. Pomelo, an exotic part of China, is something that you didn't see 20 years ago, but the last 10 years it's also there. And mandarins from Peru, for example, and exotic oranges from Brazil.
Thank you. So now the next slide I'm going to put up will overwhelm you with a lot of information in one shot, but let's take a look at world production of citrus, 1970 compared to 2015. The font, fortunately, is large enough to read. On the left side is 1970, on the right 2015. A breakdown between the major citrus categories. In 1970, there were approximately 32 million metric tons of citrus was grown worldwide. Today, approximately 108 million metric tons. So a 238% increase in the last 45 years. If you think of it, a metric ton is roughly one pallet of citrus, if you think of it in that type of quantity. What's interesting here is that while overall production of all citrus categories has increased, grapefruit as a percentage of total production was 10% in 1970, now it's just under 7%. That's been driven by changing consumer preferences. Oranges have seen a slight decrease in production. That's mainly driven by a change of from taking Valencia oranges out of production globally. And if you look at the lemon lime category, it's actually increased in the last 40 years. And most importantly, the mandarin, the blue section, has gone from 15% of global production to over nearly 30% of global production of total citrus today. And that's driven mainly by the easy peel category and the change from a seeded mandarin to a seedless mandarin. And Robert, you were touching on pomelos from China and mandarins from the southern hemisphere. And for your business, are there certain varieties of citrus, just talking citrus now, that are more likely to need the services of a third party for growers around the world? Is it all citrus varieties? What do you see?
I see on. What do you say is last? Yeah?
So again, the question would be, you were mentioning pomelos coming in from China, easy peel mandarins from Peru. Are there varieties that are more likely to growers are more likely of certain varieties to use your services compared, speaking just in terms of citrus?
I see. No, yeah, I think on the fact of sensitive growth, like easy peelers, it could be quite sensitive. It also depends on where it's coming from. From southern atmosphere, the transit time in a container could be between the 3 and 4 weeks. We have arrivals, of course, of Ooijen mandarins from Peru, what takes 3 weeks. Miniolas from California, which takes 4 weeks. What's being required then? Of course, a quality inspection at arrival needs to be done because all the information needs to be sent back to the growers. But on top of that, when the fruit is not correct but needs to supply to the European retail or the high standards of European retail, you need to have a possibility to do some sorting somewhere. It needs to be done. Therefore, we at Gogh Control we have a special line since 2015 where we are able to sort and wash the citrus before sending out. The pre on this, compared to sorting by hand, is that when there is any mold on the fruits, for example, this can be taken out. It looks much more clean after sorting. And when there is some other defects like water damage or spots, it is easily to clean. You will have a longer shelf life after sorting by sorting those by hand.
All right, thank you.
Does that make any sense?
I think so, yes. There'll be questions afterwards if it didn't. So yeah, no, thank you for that explanation. I'll point out too that the sources of the data that I'm presenting here in this slide and the following slide come from both USDA and FAO databases. What you'll find, as you find many times with data, is no two reports match or are alike, so the total production numbers here are averages between these sources. Most important though is the trends are accurate from a shift from oranges and grapefruit to mandarins and lemons. Next slide will specifically drill into mandarin production. Again, 1970 versus, I should say 2015. On the left 1970 and the right 2015. 45 years ago, roughly 5 million metric tons of mandarins were grown worldwide. Today, almost 30 million metric tons. And while total global citrus has increased 238%, the mandarin category has increased almost 500% in the last 45 years. What's interesting is you look at 1970 versus 2015, there are two major global players in the mandarin category. In 1970, it was Japan. In 2015, it's China. Each of them were roughly 50% of global mandarin production. Japan production in 1970 was mainly geared towards the fresh industry. What's happened in Japan is that as there's been a shift to urban living, urban working, the family farmer is aging, the next generation is not interested in the farming industry, and so you've seen a huge drop in production in Japan of mandarins driven by those two key reasons. China today, a majority of that production is for the processed industry. If you look in the retail canned fruit area, the majority of mandarins you find around the world, it will say product of China. While certainly they are growing for the fresh market as well, it's heavy into the processed industry. What also is interesting to look at is you see sort of a shift in the sources of production. Particularly, you look, Italy has dropped off the chart from 70 to 2015. I would say they probably didn't adapt into a seedless mandarin. They kept the older traditional varieties. Whereas you look, Spain shifted from seeded to seedless varieties and still remains an important player. And Morocco now is a serious player in the seedless mandarin production. The sponsor of today's breakfast panel, Les Domaines, certainly benefited from the innovation, if you will, the change from seeded to seedless mandarins. And the US in 1970 was about 10% of global production. That was mainly seeded varieties, both out of Florida and California. And there's a tremendous growth of production in the States, mainly in California, of seedless mandarins. And in the next 10 years, the U.S. will certainly re-enter this pie chart. And so Marcel, maybe I'd ask a question. How has your business adapted over the years to that increasing production of easy peel mandarins?
The increase of production has also led to an increase of consumption. But in the Netherlands, like 90% of all the fruit is sold in the supermarkets. We as an importer we do some supermarkets, but we focus mostly on wholesale exporters and companies where we export ourselves. Most of the retail clients, they source themselves in the countries of origin. So it hasn't really affected our business. We always try to distinguish ourselves from what is in the supermarket. Our clients, they focus a lot on taste and on color, and yeah, it's not about the big volumes that we are strong in. So find something different that's in the supermarket. That is what we focus on. But you see that the real good varieties like Nadakot and they have really taken over interest from the clients, instead of like Satsuma, Okitsu, those early varieties. More or less people are pulling out of that and focusing on the later, stronger varieties.
What you've seen in the U.S. as the demand for seedless mandarins is growing, there's a few key reasons in the U.S., probably transfers to Europe and other markets as well. One, it's a seedless piece of fruit. It's small, so it fits in the hand of a child. The target market is really moms and children in North America. So you have a smaller piece of fruit as opposed to even a small navel orange is large to a child, right? So seedless, small, easy to peel. It's not messy when you peel it, and a more consistent eating experience. So those are really the basic reasons why the seedless mandarin has really taken off in North America. And we learned from Spain. In 1990, there was a severe freeze in California, affected Texas as well. Citrus was not as readily available in the States. Spain started sending their clementines at that time to the U.S., and that got the attention of both the American retail, the American consumer, and then also the American citrus grower, and that was really the genesis for what is now becoming a very large part of the citrus category in the U.S. in terms of the growing production side of the business. The next two slides to me might be the most interesting part of the presentation. And first, and this is somewhat oversimplified, but this would be the global trade of easy peelers, and we'll say specifically seedless easy peelers in the year 2000. I would say also that you can use this slide and the next slide also to represent overall global citrus trade, not just easy peel mandarins. And so essentially you had, the Mediterranean areas were growing the seedless mandarins. As I mentioned, this freeze in California, when the med suppliers started coming into the U.S. in a more serious way. There's always been access to Canada over the years, although it's a smaller market, but the U.S. access really took off during the 90s. So you had the Mediterranean areas, mainly Spain, Morocco. Of course, they were trading within the European market, now coming into North America. And not so much other trade in seedless mandarins was taking place around the world. It was taking place, but this represents the majority of it in the year 2000. Then we jump ahead just 15 years later, and boom, there's seedless mandarins growing everywhere now in the world, and they move around everywhere in the world. It's not just Mediterranean suppliers supplying Europe and a little bit to the U.S. Now the U.S. is a mandarin grower going into Asia. We import citrus and easy peel mandarins from the southern hemisphere. South Africa now goes into Asia. And again, as I said, this isn't just representative, while this is the easy peel trade, it's also representative of global citrus now. I was in China earlier this year. In the wholesale market, I saw Egyptian citrus, Spanish, Moroccan, Turkish, and 15 years ago I wouldn't have seen any of that. I would have seen the US only, and maybe South Africa during their time, Southern Hemisphere season. So now, just as through the internet and through mobile phones, the world's gotten much smaller. The trade is now much more sophisticated and global. And when we think about what affects a market, it's not just the California navel crop is light this year, so the market's going to be strong. We have to think about what's happening in Egypt, what's happening in South Africa and Southern Hemisphere and other Northern Hemisphere suppliers, as there's now so much more trade globally around the world. And again, I'll just, to me it's just quite interesting and how it's impacted the business. And as I said, there are 195 countries in the world, 140 grow citrus, and that's the competitive world that we live in today in terms of the citrus trade, not only for mandarins, but for citrus as well. And so Marcel, maybe I'd ask a comment to you. So Europe's long been a more open market compared to the rest of the world, certainly very competitive compared to other markets in the world. Now today that's changing globally as all markets are becoming more competitive, but comment maybe if you just look at this map here specifically, how has your business evolved as this map has evolved?
The growers and the suppliers, they have a lot more options. So traditionally sending everything to Europe and it will work out just fine, that has completely changed.
Yes.
In the past you would have received almost all the fruit like in consignment or commission, and it changed to low MGPs, then it changed from low MGPs to high MGPs, and slowly you see fixed price deals as well happening. Because they are just saying we can sell it to Asia or to the Middle East and they pay us that kind of money. If you want to have the fruit, that is the option that you'll have. So in a way it makes makes less fruit available also a good thing, because then the reason for everybody is the same. Everybody's paying like the same level, and there's less, maybe a bit of less competition. But on the other hand, the margins are getting tight. They are getting smaller. You have to do more fruit to get the same returns as in the past. So yeah, it's not easier than it used to be, but it's the way it is. In the Netherlands specifically, you see that the levels in the supermarkets are at the lowest of all of Europe actually. Wherever we go, France or Switzerland or Scandinavia or even Germany or Belgium, the prices in the retail are more or less always higher than in the Netherlands. Fruit and vegetables is a promotional item that attracts consumers, and it has its effect on the price level that the retailer is willing to pay. So it gets tighter and tighter, so that's not easy.
I'll expand on Marcel's comments there. My viewpoint, generally speaking, in terms of citrus, North America is the #1 returning market for growers around the world. #2 would be Asian markets, and then #3, to Marcel's point, would be the European markets. Just so much more competitive, so fewer restrictions to access the market makes Europe very competitive, let alone from the retail landscape and the hard discounters and things that have kind of been born here in the European market. And Robert, maybe a question for you. Again, looking at this map compared to 2000, and now the world's really exploded in global trade. For your industry, for your business, do you see looking at expanding into other markets, and do you have growers saying, hey, why don't you do this in China for us? Are there changes taking place in that?
Of course, that question has been done quite a lot, due to the fact that there is a lack of warehousing, cold storage in China, India, for example, and professional equipment there to keep the cold chain from start to end as it used to be. To the other side, if I may speak only for our part, the fruits and vegetables at all is still increasing. We also specialize in exotic parts, fruits. So it means like blueberries, avocados, mangoes is still the volumes coming in into Europe. We also see that China is a big competition to Europe compared to 10 years ago, and that will still increase the next couple of years. But we still have a lot of challenges to make here in Europe. As you told, Europe is a competitive market. On the other side, it's also a quite transparent market, what Marcel also told. So the line between the grower and the final retailer is quite short due to the new technology. And if I may speak for the thing what I'm doing, logistics-wise, logistic provider can give a help on that.
Thanks. We're moving through the presentation very promptly, and maybe at this time I want to put one of our guests, one of the listeners here on the spot. That'd be Anton Filippo of LBP. It's a similar company to a service provider to growers around the world, and I'd just like to get your input, Anton, in terms of, as you looked at this presentation, and what changes have you seen specific to the European market and your business, and where you see other opportunities coming up in the world, if I could do that.
You surprised me here a little bit, of course. I wasn't prepared for this question, but well, to be very honest, what Robert is saying is exactly what is happening at the moment. We have to look at other opportunities, and I think that for our industry in the logistics, that's our challenge. And yes, if you look at the citrus industry, well, that is changing definitely, as you see for all the other fruits and vegetables that are grown and shipped around the world. But that is where our challenge is, and I think for us in our industry, if it's not citrus, it could be avocados next week, or it could be blueberries the other week. So for us, there's always opportunities. But yes, it's getting more difficult. We see that China is taking a growing part of everything that's been grown in the world. So I think for us as companies, it's difficult. But I think it's especially going to be very difficult for the structure that Europe has in the fruit industry, in working in commission and in the consignment. I think that is where the challenge is for the industry. So that's my opinion.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Anton, for that. Now I'm gonna put Andrew. I'm gonna put you on the spot as well here, mate. So we have in the far right-hand corner that tiny little continent known as Australia. Andrew Mom from Freshmax exhibiting here and a sponsor here as well. And be curious from your perspective of Australia is a very small domestic market. They have to export to survive. And be curious as you look at this map. And if you think in terms of citrus and easy peel, what changes have taken place within the Australia industry as a supplier? While it's a small industry relative maybe to the U.S. on a global basis, everyone knows Australia is an important Southern Hemisphere provider.
Thanks, Dan. I guess we're seeing a big change towards easy peel in Australia as well, and we're probably lagging a little behind in other domestic markets around the need for seedlessness, but that's coming and is part of it there. Obviously, where our location close to China is, China's a really big part of what we do and our future going forward. I guess personally I share some concerns about everywhere in the world thinks that China is the holy grail and China will be the answer to everyone's oversupply problems. It's not easy. There will be problems and challenges, and I think we need to be careful that from a world perspective, we don't see China as being the answer to everybody's problems in the citrus industry. But you know, it's been very profitable for Australian producers, and it's helped our industry immensely in the last 5 years. We were quite large exporters to the United States. We've lost a lot of that market share coming from up the Southern Hemisphere producers, particularly South America and South Africa. So Asia's certainly a key core focus for us, and there will be some niche opportunities in other markets and some of the the easy peels, and perhaps teaming with some of the strong branded products that are in the space of the seedless easy peel.
Expand a little bit on Andrew's comments. Thank you, Andrew. Australia was the original counter-seasonal navel that came into the U.S. market over 20-some years ago. And then as South Africa, as Chile have gained access to the U.S. market, and China has grown as an importer consumer of Southern Hemisphere citrus, Australia is virtually non-existent now in the U.S. It once upon a time was 100% of the import navel industry, and it's maybe 5 or 10% now at this point in time, all driven by returns. And I'd maybe expand a little more too when you look at China 20-some years ago, when China was, I think 1993, I made my first visit to China. At that time it was gray market business, and the concern was that China was going to learn how to grow, and just talking citrus, was going to grow citrus and was going to take over the Asian markets, and the US would lose the market in Asia. And in fact, that hasn't happened. As the middle class has increased, consumption has increased, and interest in safe products. China actually continues to grow as an import market, as an import buyer of citrus around the world, not just from the US, Australia, and as I'd mentioned now, the Mediterranean countries, as they face a saturated market in Europe, they're now looking to the China market as well. Robert, I'll pass that off to you there. The last slide, again, it's a fair amount of information in one shot, but I'll talk through it here. And this will be the actually second to last slide, but market access. As we look at this map here, we see all this trade now taking place, market access becomes even more key, even more critical. And there's several really important drivers in market access, both today and in the future. The first would be pest and disease pressures. As this global trade has expanded, it means, you know, the bugs and diseases now move around faster than they used to. And you look, if you think about it, even from, I always look at disease from a human standpoint. Airplanes now, we can be anywhere in the world in 24 hours, so that means that cough that you picked up in Sri Lanka 24 hours ago is now in middle America. And so you think about it too from a plant and fruit perspective. Those pests and diseases now can move around the world much quicker, and naturally we don't want those pests and diseases to move around the world. Some of the more important ones over the years, there was tristasia, young tree decline. That's is a viral disease. Canker, a bacterial disease. When I first got in the business, canker was a problem in Florida. Now Florida has been overrun and with greening, citrus greening disease. I would say, bring on canker now, because that's an easy one to solve. And then, well, we have this greening disease to deal with, which is a real challenge. That's also a bacterial disease. Black spot, I think Anton or maybe Robert mentioned black spot, and that's more of a concern here in the European market. So as you go through history, each one of these diseases seems to be the end of things, but we overcome it. As an industry globally, greening is currently a very big issue, but we'll overcome that, and then there'll be the next pestilence that will come along. But the pest and disease pressure, as trade expands globally, becomes even more of a concern. And if you look at pest and disease, in my opinion, post-harvest solutions are imperative, if not the only long-term solution to pest and disease pressure. Currently, you look in California and Florida, Texas, and the US, growers are spending a tremendous amount of money in the field trying to control various pests and diseases, but it's not providing the needed results. It's providing some effective control, but not enough for the amount of money that's being spent. It is not eliminating these pest and disease pressures. And if you look at it, so there's the GMO, genetically modified organism solutions. They're complex, right? There's social concerns and many other issues that come along with GMO solutions. So while there are some, and there will be more in the future, it's a challenge. And so from a post-harvest standpoint, there are new fumigants being developed. Methyl bromide is being eliminated around the world, and it's damaging to most fruit and veg. So there's new fumigants that are being developed for post-harvest control and effective post-harvest control of disease and pests. An example there would be phosphine for the control of of bean thrip, a pest that certain countries want to keep out. Drenches such as malic acid are being looked at for control of fuller rose beetle eggs. So in different handling techniques, whether it be from post-harvest techniques, for example, maybe it's stainless steel holding tanks in the packing house. But these require large investments too, potentially as well. Also, a new fumigant or a drench may present a MRL challenge in a given market. So you do something to control a pest, now you lose access to an overseas market because of trying to control that pest. Now I get back to GMO solutions. To a certain extent, it also becomes, and I think they're inversely correlated, as you want to reduce pesticide usage for the environment and reduce MRLs, that kind of raises the need for a GMO type solution to effectively control those pests, diseases without the use of chemicals or the minimum use of chemicals. And then lastly, you get into acceptable work plans, right? The pest and disease pressure, post-harvest solutions all affect these market access agreements around the world, work plans as we refer to them. And it's both, there's trade implications, there's science implications, and there's political implications to these agreements as well that all come into play. And as there continues to be ongoing political turmoil, that impacts trade agreements. It impacts the abilities of government organizations to work effectively between each other among governments as the political turmoil comes into play, and that cooperation becomes a challenge. So the market access issues will continue to become very critical as this global trade has expanded. In conclusion, we'll have a few minutes for some questions if there are any, and so we're out of time, but not out of mind. Food safety, it's been discussed in Tim York's presentation beforehand, is important, and food safety varies among the regions. Europe has one kind of viewpoint and requirements of food safety, and the US is different, and Asia is kind of in between. So there are challenges. Obviously, it's growing in importance as retail business expands around the world, but it differs between markets as well. And then logistics. I think, again, in Tim's presentation mentioned the increasing cost of logistics. Okay, maybe just transportation, but you have service providers as well as part of that logistics equation. Today, you can have 30 to 40% of your delivered cost is just in the logistics. So almost half the cost is logistics versus the actual product itself. So we'll hope to see you in 2018 and expand on those issues as well. So we have a couple minutes. I'd open it up if we did have any questions from the audience.
Thank you. Mark Gold, Produce Business. One of your slides that showed, striking to me, and I was around in 1970 but wasn't quite working yet, was showing Japan at 50% and then basically at 0, and then Morocco at 4%. So you mentioned about Morocco being a sponsor today. Do you see that market getting a higher percentage? Do you see them growing?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know on land availability, water resources, that type of thing in Morocco, but certainly there's favorable growing conditions there that would allow it to expand that business. Absolutely. Japan is still a small player in the Mandarin trade, but it's almost insignificant. When I first got in the business, even for Florida grapefruit, it was the first question was always, what's the Japan Mekong crop this year? Now you don't even hear of it. Yeah. And I don't know, perhaps Marcel, you might have a comment on Morocco and their ability to continue to expand in the future. Thank you.
We've traditionally seen Morocco, exporting to Europe, and I think they realized when a couple of years ago, when there came this Russian ban on European fruit, that they saw the Russian market as their that was like gold for them. But I think in the meantime, they seem to look back to Europe more and more than in the past. I feel they're focusing on better varieties, and slowly but slowly they come back to Europe, because I think they learned some hard lessons also in Russia for sure. But slowly it's focusing more on our market again.
Sure. I think we had one other question here, Andrew. But I'll expand on what Marcel was just saying there in Morocco. And certainly they are innovative in terms of the new varieties and looking at new varieties from mandarins. So assuming they have the land and other resources, they're focused on growing the right varieties, which is going to help them increase in the future. Andrew.
Thanks, Dan. My question's around the North American easy peel market. What's your view on how much the brand development that's been done, which has been very significant in your market, how much has that contributed to the growth of easy peel? It's very unique.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. What Andrew is referring to in terms of the easy peel mandarins, and I'm familiar with having worked for both of those brands, Cuties as well as Halos, consumer brands, heavily advertised to consumers in the U.S. And that's a tough question to answer, Andrew, because there was so much growth as production grew, demand grew, right? And so could you associate that consumer brand with that growth? I think part of the reason those brands are going after the consumer is as the rest of the industry, non-branded, has caught up in terms of production, they want to keep that brand foremost in the consumer's mind. So I'd say probably in the next 5 years we'll be able to better say that consumer branding has been effective, because now we have retailers have many other options besides just those two large brands. They're dominant in the industry, but now we're starting to get some saturation on production versus demand. And I think in the next maybe in 3 to 5 years, we will be in a better position to answer that question.